My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the text message from my sister. Hey Ellie, just so you know, Dad and Mom sold your old Mustang yesterday. They got $8,500 for it. Thought you should know. Just like that. As if they were telling me they'd cleaned out my childhood closet or donated some old books. That 1967 Mustang wasn't just a car. It was the only thing I had left from Grandpa Joe before cancer took him. I'd spent 4 summers restoring it with him, learning every inch of that engine, feeling the grease under my fingernails, inhaling the scent of old leather and motor oil that somehow smelled like love. I called my sister back immediately, my voice cracking. What do you mean they sold it? That's my car. Well, it was just sitting in the garage gathering dust since you moved to Boston, she replied with that familiar condescending tone. Dad needed the space for his workshop. Besides, you haven't been home in over a year. I ended the call and slumped against my apartment wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. My parents hadn't even called me themselves. They'd sent my sister to do their dirty work just like they always did when they knew they were wrong. My relationship with my parents had been strained since I decided to pursue art instead of taking over the family accounting firm. Artists starve, Elizabeth, my father would say over and over. Accountants buy vacation homes. It was his catchphrase, delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. In our household, practicality was the religion, and my father was the high priest. My mother, once a promising pianist who gave it all up for marriage, became his most devoted follower. My sister Patricia followed in their footsteps perfectly straight as, accounting degree, married her college sweetheart, bought a house 3 blocks from our parents. The golden child. Then there was me, the family disappointment. The dreamer. The one who painted murals in abandoned buildings and had exhibitions in coffee shops. The one who worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for art supplies instead of growing up and getting real. When I received a scholarship to an art program in Boston last year, they barely acknowledged it. That's nice, honey, my mother had said, before immediately changing the subject to Patricia's promotion. I moved out 2 weeks later, leaving most of my belongings behind except my art supplies and the keys to my Mustang. I'd told them I'd be back for the car once I found a place with parking. It'll be fine in the garage until then, my father had assured me. No rush. Apparently, no rush had an expiration date I wasn't informed about. In the week following my sister's text, my parents avoided my calls with expert precision. My father's secretary claimed he was in meetings. My mother texted that she was busy with the church fundraiser and would call when things calmed down. My sister stopped answering altogether. I tried reasoning with them via text. That car was Grandpa's gift to me. It has sentimental value. How could you sell something that wasn't yours to sell? My father finally replied, you abandoned it. We needed the space. The money is in your old savings account. You should be thanking us for handling it. Abandoned it? As if I'd tossed it on the side of the road instead of storing it in their 3-car garage that only ever held 2 vehicles. As if I hadn't specifically told them I was coming back for it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through old photos of Grandpa and me working on the car. His weathered hands guiding mine as we replaced spark plugs. His booming laugh when I got grease on my nose. This car will outlive us all, Ellie girl, he'd said. Take care of it and it'll take care of you. I failed him. I let them take the last piece of him I had. The tears came hot and fast, soaking my pillow as I curled into myself, feeling more alone than I ever had in Boston. My roommate Amy found me still awake at 3 a.m., sitting on our tiny balcony, staring at nothing. You know, she said after I explained everything, this isn't just about a car. This is about them thinking they still control your life, your possessions, your choices. Her words hit me like a physical force. This pattern had been playing out my entire life, my parents deciding what was valuable, what was worth keeping, what dreams were acceptable to pursue. So what do I do now? I whispered. You take back your power, Amy said simply. Whatever that looks like for you. 3 days later, I walked into my boss's office at the gallery where I worked part-time. "I need a week off," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in days. Family emergency. That afternoon, I boarded a bus headed for my hometown in Pennsylvania. 6 hours of watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to rolling countryside, my determination growing with each mile. I wasn't coming to beg. I wasn't coming to cry. I was coming to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I checked into a motel instead of calling my parents. That evening, I walked the 3 blocks to my sister's house, knowing she'd be home from work by now. When she opened the door, her eyes widened. "Ellie? What are you doing here?" "Where's my car, Patricia?" I asked, stepping past her into the entryway without waiting for an invitation. "I told you, Dad and Mom sold it." Her voice had that nervous quality it always got when she was hiding something. "To whom?" I pressed, standing my ground even as she tried to usher me toward the kitchen. "Some collector from Pittsburgh. Look, what's done is done. The money's in your account." "I don't want the money." My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. "I want my car. I want the only thing I had left of Grandpa that meant something to me." Patricia's husband appeared from the living room, his presence meant to intimidate. "Everything okay here, babe?" "It's fine, Mark," she said quickly. "Ellie was just leaving." I stood my ground, feeling something inside me that had been dormant for too long, the fire of righteous anger. "I'm not going anywhere until I get the buyer's information. That car wasn't yours to sell." That night in the motel, memories flooded back as I stared at the ceiling. I was 12 when Grandpa first showed me the rusted Mustang in his barn. Mom and Dad had dropped me off for summer break while they took Patricia to volleyball camp in Florida. "Your dad thinks this old thing should go to the junkyard," Grandpa had said, patting the dusty hood. "But I see potential. Do you see it, Ellie girl?" I remember nodding, not because I saw anything special in the rusted metal, but because I wanted to please him. But as the weeks passed, as we sanded away rust and rebuilt the engine piece by piece, I began to see what he meant. There was beauty in restoration, in bringing something back to life. "Your father never understood cars," Grandpa told me one afternoon as we replaced the transmission. "Or art. Or anything that doesn't fit into his spreadsheets." He wiped grease from his hands and looked at me intently. "Don't let him put you in a box, Ellie. You're meant for bigger things." Every summer after that, I'd return to Grandpa's farm and we'd work on the Mustang. By the time I was 16, it was nearly restored. By the time I was 18, it purred like it had just rolled off the assembly line. The day I got my license, Grandpa handed me the keys. "It's yours now," he said. "I've already changed the title. No matter what happens, remember this car belongs to you." The next morning, I sat in a coffee shop downtown, staring into my mug when someone slid into the booth across from me. I looked up to see Charlie Martinez, my high school best friend who now worked at the county clerk's office. "Your text sounded urgent," he said, placing a manila folder on the table between us. "What's going on, Ellie?" I explained the situation, watching his face shift from confusion to outrage. "That's messed up," he said when I finished. "But why did you need me to pull the vehicle records?" I took a deep breath. Before I left for Boston, I officially transferred the title to my name. Grandpa had already signed it over to me years ago, but I never filed the paperwork because it didn't seem important while the car was safe. But something told me to make it official before I left. Charlie's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "So legally. It's mine. Completely mine. They sold a car they didn't own." He pushed the folder toward me. "These records confirm it. The Mustang is registered to Elizabeth and Carter, that's you. If they sold it, they committed fraud," I finished, a strange calm settling over me. "And now I have proof." Charlie leaned forward. "What are you going to do?" I looked down at the official documents, my name in black and white. "First, I'm going to confront my parents. Then I'm going to get my car back." As I left the coffee shop, Charlie called after me. "You've changed." The old Ellie would have just accepted this and moved on. I smiled. The old Ellie let people walk all over her dreams. I'm done with that. The doorbell echoed through my parents' house. My mother opened the door, her surprise quickly masked by a practiced smile. Elizabeth, what a lovely surprise. Why didn't you tell us you were coming? I stepped inside. Where's Dad? In his study, but he's working. Maybe we should. I brushed past her, heading directly for the room at the end of the hall. I pushed open the door without knocking. My father looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face. Elizabeth? What are you doing here? I placed the folder on his desk, opening it to reveal the title and registration papers. You sold my car. He glanced at the documents, then back at me. We've been through this. You left it here. We needed the space. No, Dad. You sold my car. Not the family car. Not your car. My car that is legally registered in my name. I tapped the document. This is the title transfer that I filed before I left for Boston. Grandpa signed the car over to me years ago. The color drained from his face as he examined the papers more closely. My mother appeared in the doorway, confusion written across her features. Robert? What's going on? My father stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. That car was sitting in our garage, which I asked you to let me do until I found a place with parking in Boston. I interrupted. You promised it would be safe here. We didn't think you were serious about keeping that old thing, my mother interjected. You left everything else behind. I left things I could replace, I said, turning to face her. That car was irreplaceable, and you knew what it meant to me. My father's voice hardened. The sale is done, Elizabeth. The buyer paid cash and drove it away himself. Then you'd better find him, I said, my voice steady, because you sold stolen property. I could press charges. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face turned from pale to red. You wouldn't dare, he whispered. I met his gaze without flinching. Try me. I spent that night at Charlie's apartment, too angry to stay in a motel, too proud to ask my parents if I could sleep in my old room. We stayed up late, talking about the years since high school, about how we'd both changed. I always knew you had this in you, Charlie said as we shared leftover pizza. This fire. You just needed to believe it yourself. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my father. We found the buyer, he said without preamble. I've explained this situation. He's willing to return the car if we refund his money plus an additional $1,000 for his trouble. And? I prompted, knowing there was more. And we'll do that, he said, his voice strained. Your mother and we made a mistake. We should have asked you. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from him before. 3 hours later, I stood in my parents' driveway as a truck pulled up with my Mustang on a trailer. The middle-aged man who climbed out looked annoyed, but resigned as he handed my father an envelope containing the title he'd been given a fake, I realized. My father handed over a cashier's check, his movement stiff, his pride visibly wounded. The car was carefully unloaded, and as the man drove away, I walked around the Mustang, checking for any new damage. It was exactly as I'd left it. I ran my hand along the hood, feeling Grandpa's presence in every curve of metal. I got it back, I whispered. I didn't let it go. Before I left, I made one last stop at my sister's house. She looked shocked to see me standing on her porch again. I got the Mustang back, I said without preamble. She shifted uncomfortably. Dad told me, look, Ellie, we thought we were doing you a favor. That car is so old, and the maintenance alone. That wasn't your decision to make. I cut her off. None of you get to decide what matters to me anymore. Patricia's expression hardened. You always have to be dramatic, don't you? You could have just taken the money and bought a newer car. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's the difference between us, Patty. You've always seen things as replaceable. relationships, dreams, even family heirlooms. But some things aren't. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done letting you and mom and dad make me feel like what I value doesn't matter. Like what I choose doesn't count. Like my dreams are less important because they don't fit into your narrow definition of success. Her eyes widened at my directness. For the first time in our lives, I wasn't backing down, wasn't softening my words to keep the peace. "So what now?" she asked, her voice small. "You're just going to drive off and never come back?" "I'll come back when you're all ready to see me, the real me, not the version of me you want me to be." As I walked away, I heard her call after me, her voice cracking, "Ellie, wait." I turned, not wanting to hope but unable to help myself. "I was jealous," she blurted out, her eyes welling with tears. "Of you and Grandpa. Of how close you were. Of how he believed in you so completely." "I told Dad to sell the car," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what it meant to you, and I wanted to hurt you." "I'm so sorry, Ellie." The confession hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I thought Patricia was just Dad's perfect echo. I never realized she had her own resentments brewing. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why would you want to hurt me?" "Because you got to leave," she said simply. "You got to chase your dreams while I stayed trapped in the life they planned for me. And every time you came home with your art and your stories, it reminded me of everything I gave up to be the daughter they wanted." For the first time, I saw my sister clearly not as my antagonist, but as another casualty of our parents' rigid expectations. The drive back to Boston took 14 hours, including stops for gas and food. Every mile put distance between me and my past, while simultaneously bringing me closer to the person I was meant to be. The Mustang ran perfectly, as if Grandpa himself was making sure I got home safely. My phone had been buzzing with texts throughout the journey from my mother, my father, even Patricia. I hadn't responded to any of them. They would have to wait until I was ready. The next morning, I woke early and took the Mustang for a drive along the coast, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic in shades of pink and gold. I found a secluded spot overlooking the water and pulled over. Taking out my sketchbook, the one I always kept in the glove compartment, I began to draw. Not the ocean or the sunrise, but the car itself, with Grandpa standing beside it, his hand resting on the hood, his smile warm and proud. When I finished, I took a photo of the drawing and sent it to my parents and sister with a simple message: "This is what you tried to sell. Not just a car, but my history, my connection, my passion. I hope someday you'll understand the difference." Later that week, a letter arrived from my father, an actual handwritten letter, something I'd never received from him before. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a beginning. "I never understood why that car meant so much to you," he wrote. "Maybe I never tried to understand. Your grandfather saw something in you that I missed. I'd like the chance to see it too. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A crack in the wall. A possibility. Sometimes the things we fight hardest to keep aren't things at all, but pieces of ourselves, our history, our voice, our right to choose what matters." My Mustang sits outside my apartment now, a daily reminder that I am strong enough to stand up for myself, to reclaim what's mine, to drive my own life in whatever direction I choose. And no one, not even family, has the right to take the wheel from my hands again.